rate was a scant 2%. I didn't know anybody ever had an unemployment rate of 2%, but it was well below state and national averages. But by 2010, just 10 years later, it had soared to almost 16%. That was one of the four sharpest city unemployment increases in the United States. A small, bucolic manufacturing mecca had become an economic disaster zone in North Carolina, and it has largely stayed that way since. For the first time in the last decade, homelessness has become a daunting problem. The Salvation Army Shelter of Hope, which does stunningly powerful work, is pressed well beyond its capacity. As a result, some 200 or 250 wounded souls live in the woods surrounding town. They patch together makeshift cardboard lean-tos and dilapidated tents, keeping a wary eye for police and complaining neighbors. In the summer, the camps bear the oppressive markers of the South: intense heat, draining humidity, sudden rainstorms, relentless mosquitoes, yellow jackets, gnats, and snakes. In the winter, snow and frost pose distinct and direct dangers. More than one homeless struggler has perished against the cold. About a third of those living out, as it's called, are women. Some are kids, though their parents, fearing abuse and neglect proceedings, work hard to hide them. Roger Cornett and the 15 or so volunteers of the Open Door Homeless Relief Project, which is run out of the basement of a tiny Baptist church in nearby Conover, North Carolina. These folks spend much of their days and nights and almost all of their immensely thin resources trying to keep people living in the woods of Hickory whole and safe and well and alive. Cornett is a 65-year-old retired businessman who suffers from a debilitating neuromuscular disorder. He doesn't look the part of the heart on your sleeves do-gooder as he crosses the county in his battered pickup truck, NRA sticker prominently displayed. But Cornett and his cohorts venture into the often dangerous campgrounds in the woods of Hickory, distributing tents, tarps, food, cook stoves, utensils, propane cylinders, blankets, trash bags, clothing, portable heaters, and even dog food. I couldn't believe, he told me, that people were being left to live like animals in my own home county. A thin man in his 30s, Bill Stock, tells me that a lot of us out here would be dead without Roger and his people. You learn not to look vulnerable, he says. A woman has to get with a man or she'll get hurt. Making the point, Cornett introduces me to a lesbian couple living along the wood lines. Janet Teal was raped, beaten, and stabbed 2 days earlier. She shows me 13 stab wounds. The sight is sickening. Cornett had helped to subdue the assailant. I don't know how long we're going to last out here, she says. When we talked, Marcia Stimpson, who was 47, reported that she was then living in the Salvation Army shelter that I mentioned for the third time. I'm one of their best bell ringers, she says, a top producer. But you have to leave after 3 months, and I haven't been able to make enough money to eat and afford a place to live. You know, when you hear people say, if it wasn't for my spouse, I'd be poor. That's me, she says. She spoke with precision, but without emotion. I was self-employed, doing pretty well, working in finance, but then my business crashed. I lost my job, my income, my apartment, my car. I don't fit the norms, she tells me. I don't have any addictions. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do drugs. I don't have any kids. I'm not pregnant. I don't have medical issues. I don't have a mental illness. I've been advised to act like I'm crazy, but I won't do it. There's no funding for someone like me, she said. I'm almost 50 and it's bad now, but I worry what it's going to be like when I'm older. Stimson's lived in the woods surrounding Hickory for months at a time for several years. I'm self-sufficient, she said. For ages, I wouldn't apply for food stamps. It was too embarrassing. She recounts a hard cycle. I work and save a little money, then I try to get housing. Like I was working at Healthy Home Market in Hickory, but it closed and I lost my apartment. At first, I liked the thought of living outside, she says. I always enjoyed camping. But she quickly learned that you have to be secretive all the time. If people find out where you are, they'll call the cops or they'll steal your stuff or worse. She lived most of the time with a friend named Dave, who I also met. So other men would generally leave her alone. But even then, she didn't feel safe. To tell you the truth, she told me, in the middle of the night, I find raccoons even more frightening than men. Stimson packed all her belongings in a trash bag each morning and took them with her so no one would steal them. When I'd come back, I sneaked past the mobile homes up by the road because if they saw her, they'd report her. But the morning's not so bad, she said. I'm an early riser. So as long as I get out of the woods by 5 o'clock, then I don't have to worry so much about being seen. She was shocked when she first came to Hickory. There were hundreds of people living in the woods, lots living in their cars, a lot more couch hopping, going from place to place. There are some amazing people here, she told me, like the Open Door folks. But mostly no one can stand homeless people. The sight of us gives them the creeps. In words that I haven't been able to forget, Stimson explained to me, when you've lost your job and lost your savings and lost your home and your car, and then I even lost my cat, which was very dear to me. I know that sounds funny or stupid, but losing my cat hurt me deeply. Because when you lose everything, you lose your sense of being a person. You lose your own independent identity. You lose your own space to fill in the world. It gets hard to remember that you're still a human being, that you have a chance at a decent life, or that you deserve one, that you are worthy of existence. I wrote most of that 2.5 years ago, but I've been meeting again in the last couple of weeks with the remarkable Hickory folks. Roger Cornett and his colleagues minister still to well over 150 stressed and often broken souls living out. Unemployment, crushingly, has returned to elevated levels in Hickory, higher than in 2017, with potent job losses experienced again in the manufacturing, textile, and hospitality sectors. By 2021, the Hickory metropolitan area faced one of the highest joblessness rates in North Carolina. And Cornett explains, even if you can find work, you can't make ends meet on $9 an hour, not with housing and groceries and food and electricity and a car and gas. A lot of folks here still fall between the cracks. They want to work, they want to fend for themselves, but they can't manage it. A bunch of families I know would like to help their troubled relatives to take them into their own places, but they can't pull it off. They've got small houses to begin with, and they can't really make ends meet themselves. Hickory desperately needs affordable housing, but we don't have enough of it. Chaplain Cornett's personal burden has been amplified. Now in his late 60s, Cornett's neuromuscular disorder has progressed. He's now forced to undergo a more wrenching therapy regime, and his doctor has demanded that he limit the trips he takes into the woods. A younger, heartful, and courageous chaplain, James Herman, has taken point on Open Doors outreach efforts into the homeless camp. Though Cornett still runs the ministry 24 hours a day and finds the resources to sustain the work, and he inspires the other volunteer troops to keep folks in Catawba County from starving or freezing to death. Still, Cornett acknowledges, given his own immune system challenges, I'm lucky that working in the woods of Hickory for almost a decade hasn't killed me. 4 campers close to Cornett have died in recent months. Hickory needs to do more. It's obvious. People know it. He asked city council members to please come out with me to see the folks trying to eke out an existence in the woods surrounding Hickory, but none has ever been willing to come. Still, Cornette's resolute. We'll keep fighting. We'll keep on operating, keep people from starving, keeping people alive. He adds, I want to do more. I don't know how to do it. We have the heart, but we don't have the resources. I worry that I'm sort of a failure at the fundraising business. I wish people had more of a heart for the people who are struggling here day in and day out. It's broader than homelessness and living in the woods. People can't afford a decent and safe place to live. They want to be proud of where they live. They want to take care of it. It used to be different, but who can afford to get by on minimum wage in North Carolina? We need to have more empathy for what people actually face. Poverty is insidious. It creates a downward spiral that can be almost impossible to escape. And it is destroying North Carolina and the United States. So that's the first story. Let me get a drink. Second, Evan Ashkin is a doctor of family medicine at the UNC Medical School. He serves patients at Prospect Hill Community Center in southern Caswell County, where a majority of those he sees are Spanish-speaking and poor. Almost half are farmers, Black, white, Latino. A quarter are on Medicaid, 30% get Medicare, and 40% are uninsured. They don't fit the proffered stereotype, he tells me, lazy freeloaders looking to game the system and get a free handout. That viewpoint is possible, he says, only if you've never worked with anyone in this patient population. I've never met a freeloader here. His patients are simply people in excruciating circumstance, in intense distress arising from circumstances largely beyond their control. They're waiters, gardeners, farmhands, motel workers, dishwashers, day laborers, retail employees, housekeepers, and ironically, home healthcare workers. Maybe lawmakers ought to come down here and get to know them a little bit, Dr. Ashkin tells me. The doctor describes the choices that restricting healthcare coverage triggers. A man he sees comes in with a set of chest pains, but he's uninsured. Do we give him the stress test we would offer if he could pay? The clinic can't afford to continually pay for expensive procedures. So maybe the patient gets the test, maybe he doesn't. What if the doctor guesses wrong and the patient has a heart attack? We say we couldn't stand to have a two-tiered health system or have rationing in the United States. But this is rationing. It's just rationing via the wallet biopsy, he says, which is the worst possible way to allocate care. One of Ashkin's patients is undocumented and has lived in Caswell County for 7 years after fleeing violent abuse in Mexico. She was in significant distress early in a pregnancy when he was seeing her, bleeding, badly in need of an ultrasound, presenting the serious possibility of ectopic pregnancy. But because of the constraints on public funding for her care, the clinic is hard pressed to provide the needed ultrasound. And if it does, the decision may work to foreclose important scans which are necessary later in the pregnancy, essential to protect both the mom and the baby. The baby will be a citizen, as is his sibling, suggesting how artificial non-citizen funding restrictions can be. So he tells me I have to help the mother through this wrenching choice, a choice that no mother should ever be required to make. No one but a poor person would ever have to make such a choice. We want to avoid an early sonogram, but if I guess wrong, it might prove disastrous. Ashkin mentions what he calls his brother-sister test. Would I think it tolerable that my sister had to make such a choice? I believe that healthcare is a human right, he tells me, but I also believe that on a purely economic basis, the argument to extend Medicaid is unassailable. Locally, regionally, statewide, we are doing ourselves a huge disservice. Ideology is overcoming rational, common sense decision making, and it takes a hideous toll on the most vulnerable people in North Carolina. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Ashkin told me North Carolina's continuing refusal to accept Medicaid expansion, now unlike 39 other states, including DC, cut short the lives and capabilities of his patients. It poses great and heartbreaking frustration in his daily practice. Even with the support of the health center, these hardworking folks can't get in to see the specialists that they need. Specialists to treat diabetes, for example, or get screenings, colonoscopies, medicines, and tests that they require. No one likes to hear it, but sometimes they die. They die when they should survive. They die because they live in North Carolina. For very poor people, even a $20 copay can add up and pose a substantial obstacle. We see all the time that people are delaying care and not getting the essential services they need, including COVID, he says. A lot of preventative services are just unaffordable for folks. With preventative care beyond reach, conditions that could be caught and managed often deteriorate. Health care is low on your list until you get really ill. With Medicaid expansion, we'd be able to keep people well and have them actually get better outcomes and reduce unnecessary emergency room utilizations and prevent hospitalization. This has been shown over and over again. It's not some pie in the sky. It's simply what happens when people get health care. It saves money. It saves lives. The refusal to expand Medicaid in North Carolina works a hideous toll on my patients, he says. Politics overrides good sense, and it overrides human decency. Now, speaking a little more broadly, before the outbreak of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, North Carolina had experience consistent with the nation's long economic expansion, some modest reductions in poverty. That was great, though the overall figures remain bleak. In 2018, 14% of Tar Heels were impoverished. In 2019, the percentage fell to 13.6%, a little short of 1.5 million. As ever, North Carolina's poverty rate was a good deal higher than the national average, exceeding the federal standard by 3% and reflecting the 12th or 13th highest rate among the states. Over half of North Carolina's total income was captured by the top 20% of residents. Nearly a quarter went to the top 5%. Racial income disparities continue this year undiminished. 1 of 4 Native Americans and 1 in 5 Black and Latinx Tar Heels live in poverty. Most impoverished people of all races are women. 786,000 women, 600,000 men in North Carolina. And the burden of economic hardship falls most dramatically on the youngest among us. 1 in 5 North Carolina kids now lives in poverty, 22% of kids under 5. Over 620,000 Tar Heels live in extreme poverty, that is on incomes less than half of the federal poverty threshold, which is $25,750 a year for a family of 4. And North Carolina has one of the very highest rates among the states of poverty level low wage jobs. That is, people who are working full time, fully employed, but still living in poverty. 39% of all North Carolina full-time, full-year workers make less than 2/3 of the state's median wage, meaning earning less than $28,000 a year. Contrary to the lore, these aren't kids seeking to get a little work experience before heading off to Stanford. Over 61% of North Carolina low-wage workers are aged 25 to 64. Nearly 6 out of 10 Latinx workers are included in the category, and half of all African Americans. 44% of women and 33% of men are low-wage workers. Matthew Desmond, who you know of, has written eloquently of these effectively impoverished workers. The working poor, he says, are not primarily teenagers bagging groceries or scooping ice cream and paper hats. They're adults and often parents, wiping down hotel showers and toilets, taking food orders and bussing tables, eviscerating chickens at meatpacking plants, minding children at 24-hour daycare centers, picking berries, emptying trash cans, stacking grocery shelves at midnight, driving taxis and Ubers. And, you know, our basketball coach always confused me on that. I know it's Uber, but he used to say Uber and I got used to it. Then there is, of course, the impact of COVID. North Carolina didn't cause COVID, didn't cause the pandemic. But we have taken legislative steps to target poor people that have clearly increased the wounds suffered by Tar Heels. When Republicans secured unfettered control of all 3 branches of state government in 2013, they immediately passed 2 cornerstones of their economic policy agenda. First, they literally gutted the state's unemployment compensation program, assuring that it became, as it remains, the most tight-fisted plan in the country. Representative Julia Howard, the architect of the unemployment reforms, said that the old approach had grown too rich. It was becoming like a welfare scheme. Labor scholars called the changes made a radical reduction in benefits for people unemployed through no fault of their own. By 2020, only 8.6 of North Carolina jobless workers were receiving unemployment, placing the state 51st in the nation when DC and Puerto Rico are included. Our average duration of benefits, 8.6 weeks, had shrunk to the lowest in the United States. In 2019, Wayne Vroman of the Urban Institute, who had conducted a study of North Carolina's unemployment system, explained to the legislature that our worst to be found program fiercely underserves the state's workers. Legislators seemed to beam in appreciation at that statement. Representative Dana Bumgardner, a Gaston County Republican, replied without irony, "I think where we are is a good thing. What is the point of your presentation? Last place, no regrets." Second, and soon after, in 2013, the General Assembly enacted, as I've discussed, a statute permanently rejecting Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. Though the federal government would have paid almost the entirety of the tab, in each of the 7 years since, lawmakers have maintained this odd and stubborn rejectionist stance. By 2021, North Carolina had become one of only 12 states turning aside federal support, even after an array of Republican-led states had accepted Medicaid expansion. By the outset of the COVID crisis, an estimated 635,000 poor Tar Heels would have secured affordable health care coverage through Medicaid if the state was willing to accept expansion. 60% of those in the coverage gap were members of working families. 20% of Tar Heel adults were uninsured by last year, the 7th highest rate in the United States. Then came the disease and the death and unemployment which followed the virus. A national study from mid-2020 found that an astonishing 5.4 million Americans had lost their health care coverage as a result of pandemic-caused unemployment, likely the steepest increase ever recorded. The researchers concluded that nearly half, 46%, of all increases in the uninsured resulting from the COVID pandemic occurred in just 5 states: California, Texas, Florida, New York, and North Carolina. 8 states now count more than 1 in 5 of their adults as uninsured, including Texas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and North Carolina. What those states largely have in common, of course, is membership in the Confederacy. These 2 tragic decisions, intentionally gutting our unemployment compensation program and repeatedly rejecting federally subsidized health care for North Carolina's poorest citizens, have dramatically increased the heartbreak now faced by incalculable numbers of our neighbors and their families and their friends. Even when meeting during the pandemic itself, our lawmakers refused to budge on these twin ideological markers, these wounding lines in the political sand, marrying unemployment woes and healthcare miseries. Multitudes have been left to face a brutal plague in North Carolina without compassion or care or compensation. Thomas Piketty, the massively influential inequality scholar from the Paris School of Economics, has argued that, quote, there is nothing natural in the way the American economy is organized. It is a matter of political choices, of ideology. In his 2020 book, Capital and Ideology, Piketty claimed that in the United States, in its, quote, inequality regime, concentrations of wealth not witnessed for a century have been delivered by our supposed version of hypercapitalism. The description echoes his earlier claims that economic polarization in the United States has reached, quote, spectacular heights, and more broadly, that our level of economic inequality is now probably higher than in any other society at any time in the past, anywhere in the world. He added that for the first time in history, the poor are blamed for their miseries, condemned for lack of character and talent and diligence and sacrifice and virtue, while the wealthy are lauded for their great merit, genius, and entrepreneurialism. I'm not enough of an economist to meaningfully critique Piketty's damning conclusions, but I can say tragically that his characterizations mirror the harshness of economic life in North Carolina in ways that ought to humiliate a people with the ideals that we profess. So let me stop there on that cheersome note, and Frank, maybe we can open up for questions.
Gene, thank you so much for helping us to take a look at reality in our state. I'm reminded of the aspirational words of the state toast, that we be a place where the weak grow strong and the strong grow great. We unfortunately aren't living up to our ideals. So let me ask, since I'm not able to see everyone on my screen, if you will just say your name and offer a comment or a question for Gene.
Yeah, and don't, I'm old, I've got a tough hide, so I'm willing to answer anything.
Gene, in your book, what is the title of your book?
It's called The Faces of Poverty in North Carolina.
And in your book are the sources for the data that you presented outlined?
They are.
You know, always when I make presentations.
Hundreds and hundreds of footnotes just for your.
Right, good. I look forward to.
It's a UNC Press book, and they're very much a stickler on such.
Right after the presentation, several of us from First Presbyterian Greensboro are getting together to review Stephen Sill's presentation that he has done on housing and poverty in Greensboro. I hope you've seen it.
For you. Great for you.
Yeah.
And one of the things you'll learn, what you already know about, because I've visited and spoken in Greensboro many, many times, but folks in Greensboro are frequently surprised to learn that in the last 10 years, maybe 4 or 5 of those years, Greensboro or Greensboro and High Point have been identified as the hungriest cities.
And lots of us don't want to own that.
I know. I can tell you that from experience, because about the first 10 times I talked about it, people said it couldn't possibly be true. I said, well, okay, I don't know what to tell you about that, but there are in Greensboro now, I can tell you, many great folks doing great work in low-income communities. It's a terrific place, but it's indicative of the departure between what we tend to think of our communities and what might actually be the case.
Well, thank you for this today, and I look forward to getting your book and having that as a resource. Thank you.
Other comments or questions?
I have one, Frank.
Thanks, Jess.
So Gene, hi, my name's Jess Nichol.
Nice
Nice to meet you as well. You look like you have dimples when you smile. Could you smile? Is that true?
Well, no, I don't think I have dimples, but I have close to dimples. So.
I love dimples. Well, so here's my question for you, Gene. I really appreciate your reflections on Medicaid expansion, and I'm wondering if you have any insights for what individuals and communities of faith could be doing to promote that, especially in more creative ways than just calling our rather asinine, if I may say so myself, senators and congressmen who appear to be doing nothing in this General Assembly. So if you have any suggestions, I would really welcome them, especially for people of faith in this state.
Here's what I would say on that, and I take a backseat to no one in calling our legislators asinine, but it is, and I've spoken with them. I have lobbied it. I've spoken to groups about it for years. It is, of the many outrages done by this legislature since 2011, the worst, and that's quite a competition, I've got to say. And what's even more troubling, I mean, to me, is when you talk to folks, talk to legislators, talk to governors, former governors, they don't even have a reason that they are rejecting Medicaid. They will come up with something, but then you fix that or you explain it, and they just go to the next thing. And that's because the decision is not a rational one or a balanced out one. It's ideological. It's largely just tied to the notion, I hate to say this, but it's largely tied to the notion we're not going to support anything which had anything to do with Barack Obama. And what's astonishing to me about that is they know, they have to know that over 1,000 people in North Carolina die every year as a result of that choice. I'm just thinking, if I had cast a vote, which meant that more than 1,000 of my sisters and brothers were going to die, literally die as a result of this, I'd want to think I knew why I was doing it. I'd want to think, I want to know how I can explain to the mirror when I stand in front of it why I'm doing this. You may have a different experience than I do, Jess, but talking to dozens and dozens and dozens of these folks, they don't have a clue. They don't have a rationale. They don't have a justification. Now, all that said, I do think it's getting closer. I think that the combination of the fact that it's starting to look like that our folks are willing to be the last state standing, saying we'll send millions and probably billions of dollars to other states just because we want to show what kind of asses we are. I think that gets harder to maintain. There are an increasing number of Republicans in the legislature who either are tied to hospitals or at least see some of the challenges of uncompensated care, and they're starting to move a little bit. Now, that would mean in North Carolina maybe an expansion which is modest and which included heavy work requirements and the like, but there's a little more movement than there was 4 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, when Phil Berger and Tom Tillis and Pat McCrory could not even pronounce a rationale for rejecting Medicaid. So I think if you've been discouraged as I have by the lobbying work and pressure in the past, this might not be the time to get discouraged on it. It's possible that there's some movement. I also think, and that's probably consistent with the way I write about these things now, it's a little more effective if you can move away from the ideological arguments to the stories of people's lives. You know, Jess, you will know doctors and nurses, and one things I've found that's very powerful. I was trying to figure out how do you get across to people what it's like to be a poor kid, to live in utter poverty in North Carolina, and that's kind of hard. You're not going to interview kids, and it's hard to interview their parents too, because parents don't want to talk to you about the traumas that are faced by their kids. They're embarrassed about it. So I started, I thought about this for a while and talked to a lot of folks. I started talking to teachers who teach in Title I schools. Now, to be honest, about half those teachers would want to get out and teach at wealthier schools as quick as they could. But there's fully half of them who are in those Title I schools because they call it, I love this, a calling within a calling. They believe in doing God's work with those children. And I think that what I did was I spent a lot of time over several years interviewing those teachers about what life is like for their kids, for second graders and third graders and fourth graders who are, for the most part, their parents are working or one parent is working, but they're having to work 10 hours a day, or they're working the night shift. These kids are sort of living unsupervised largely. You'll have a 8-year-old girl who's worried intensely about where her 7-year-old or 6-year-old brother and sister is going to get enough to eat. And if you learn, this is what my belief is, if you learn the challenges that people in North Carolina are actually facing, and you relate that to people, it's a harder pill to swallow, to sort of stick to your ideological claim in the face of such debilitation. So I'd say talk to folks like that. Talk to doctors and nurses and teachers and folks involved in your ministries at your churches, and learn to tell those stories as broadly as you can. It's also possible, of course, in every community to help with charitable endeavors and the like. But as you know, when you're talking about healthcare, those expenses are just so large. It's one thing to, I spend a lot of time with pantries, with our marvelous food distribution system, which is largely volunteer. It's one thing to give money and time and resources for people who can't get enough to eat. And that's a giant problem. But at least you can do better and see some more immediate good come from it than you can when it comes to providing healthcare for people. I mean, the tab for healthcare, in no small part because of the way we structure healthcare. We spend the most on healthcare by far, but we leave the most out of the system in the shadows. I was surprised to learn this too. Some you people in medicine would know it, but we not only spend more per capita on healthcare than any other country, but we spend more from public resources than any other country. So in effect, we are paying for a universal care system, we're just not getting it. And I know that sounds odd, but when you think about this, the over 50% of all healthcare expenditures in the United States come from Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA. So that's a big chunk of it, which is already in a public system. And we pay our taxes to support that public system, or we pay Medicaid payments to do that. But we leave out of the healthcare system in the shadows dramatically more than any other advanced nation. And it seems to me that's humiliating to us as a people. So I appreciate your work on that front, Jeff.
Thank you, Gene. I appreciate you.
Other comments, questions? Gene, I've heard you identify affordable housing, living wage, Medicaid expansion, and food security as primary issues. One of the things that I think underlies the ideology that often negates our efforts in these areas is the idea that poor people are just enjoying the benefits of our tax dollars and in a sense being subsidized by the rest of us. But it seems to me that the extent to which people are working full time and not able to pay their bills while subsidizing our low prices, we are the ones who are actually being subsidized by the poor. And I just wonder if you would comment on that.
Well, Frank, let me say that myth that you described is a great challenge in the United States. It's pervasive. The notion that people are living off the fat of the land and want to do that. It is completely inaccurate. And it is possible, and every low-income worker that I've ever dealt with would say this. It's possible as a conclusion, just like Dr. Ashkin said, only by people who don't spend any time with those folks. That's the main reason I wrote this book is I thought I had this hope, but I'm largely pessimistic on the hope that if people simply knew more about the challenges of low-income people, they would be inclined to do something about it. They don't know. Poverty is frequently invisible to us, and we like it that way. But here's a way of thinking about it, Frank. We are wealthier. We have more poverty, especially more child poverty, than any other advanced democracy. And we also do far less than any other advanced democracy to alleviate poverty. So you put those things together. But if you poll the American people, and even more pointedly, if you poll office holders in the United States and you ask them why we have so much poverty, they will say by about 60% that we have so much poverty because we are so much more generous with welfare benefits than any other nation. It is completely counterfactual, but we cling to it, and we're going to. I'll sort of end with this story because it's indicative of this issue. One of the things we did about 4 years ago was pass a law making it necessary for a lot of folks to take drug tests to pee in a cup for this very modest cash welfare program that we have in North Carolina. It only actually has about 35,000 beneficiaries. We spend a lot of time claiming that it's ruining the lifeblood of the state, but it's tiny. But the legislature passed this law about 4 years ago, which said they'd have to be drug tested. And they made a pilot program at the same time. And they said that what we want to do is have you report back to us next year on how much money has been saved as a result of this drug testing, which we're going to use to prove to folks. So they did that. They had the report come back, and it found that fewer than 3% of people who were tested positive for drugs. And about half of them, it didn't actually reduce the benefits that they got because the benefits were only going to their children. I remember telling some of the legislators involved in this, I said, you know, less than 3%, 2%, if you wanted some drug tests, I live in Chapel Hill, you could just walk across the campus in Chapel Hill any afternoon and you can get a good 60 to 65% takers if that's what you do. Anyway, they learned as a result of this pilot project that almost no one flunked the drug test. And of course, it's costing a lot to administer. So the test was costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars and not reaping anything. The fellow who introduced it, I'd say to his credit, I was surprised about this. He said, I'm surprised. I believe that everybody taking drugs, everybody on welfare is taking drugs. So I'm stunned with these results. He said, I'm a member of the Republican caucus where everyone believes that everyone who gets welfare payments is laying around taking drugs. So this is an astonishing message to me. Friends of mine ask him, well, okay, are you going to change the policy? Oh, no. Why not? Well, he didn't say this, but I can say it, because it humiliates poor people. It does serve that good purpose. Okay. Here's what I mean by that, Frank. We got folks deciding poverty questions, poverty policy questions, who know nothing about the challenges faced by the people that they're regulating or that they're burdening. Even then, when they learn about it, they choose to ignore it like it was some sort of religious tenet, a tenet of selfishness and greed and hatefulness. So that's indicative of the challenges that we face in North Carolina. I wish it wasn't so, but it is. And I'll stop there. I don't want to.
Well, you have blessed us with what we need more of, and that is helping us to face reality and understand the truth more clearly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, guys. It's good to talk to you. Good luck in your work.
Hey, before we leave, I think as we get started addressing these things more fully, we probably need to pray. So I'd like to invite us to pray together. Fill us with your Holy Spirit, O God. May we burn with a passion for justice, and may we show your love that we know in Jesus. And all God's people said, amen. 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 Thanks, Dean. Thanks to everybody for joining.
Right.